For 1,000 years, waking up at 3 a.m. wasn't a symptom, it was a scheduled part of the night. It had a name, doctors planned around it, couples depended on it, monks built entire liturgies on top of it, and then, in less than a single generation, we forgot it ever existed, and started medicating ourselves for doing it. It's 3 a.m. and you're awake, again. Your eyes open in the dark and you already know, before you even check, that it's somewhere in the dead middle of the night. You roll over anyway. The phone screen burns your retinas and confirms what your body already told you. 3:12. You have to be up in 4 hours. Your brain immediately starts doing arithmetic, calculating how much sleep you can still salvage if you fall back asleep right now, which of course guarantees that you won't. So you lie there, your heart rate ticks up, you think about the morning, you think about how tired you're gonna be, you think about how this keeps happening, and you start to wonder if something is actually wrong with you. You're not alone in that thought. Roughly 1 in 3 adults in the Western world reports regular difficulty with what doctors call sleep maintenance insomnia, which is the clinical term for waking up in the middle of the night and struggling to fall back asleep. It has its own diagnostic code, its own pharmaceutical aisle. We throw melatonin gummies, weighted blankets, white noise machines, mouth tape, magnesium supplements, and blue light blocking glasses at this problem with the quiet desperation of people who believe their bodies are malfunctioning. And that belief is the real problem, because the idea that healthy sleep means one single, unbroken 8-hour descent into unconsciousness is not some timeless biological truth. It is shockingly recent. For most of recorded history, across most of the inhabited world, nobody slept like that. Almost nobody even tried. What you're experiencing at 3 a.m., that strange, unwelcomed window of wakefulness in the dead of night, has a name. Several names, actually. And for the vast majority of human civilization, it wasn't a problem to be solved. Your ancestors called it the watch. The French had an even more evocative word for it, dorveil, the waking sleep. And between roughly the fall of Rome and the invention of the light bulb, this interval between first sleep and second sleep was one of the most intimate, creative, and spiritually charged hours of the entire day. You are not broken. You are not failing at sleep. We've just forgotten where we have come from and who we really are. The man who pulled this lost world back into the light was a Virginian tech historian named Roger Ekirch. In 2001, after 16 years of digging through court records, personal diaries, medical texts, and literary sources, he published a paper that quietly rewrote the history of sleep. His argument was simple, and once you see the evidence, impossible to unsee. Before the modern era, Western Europeans slept in 2 distinct phases, and everybody knew it. The pattern worked like this. You went to bed shortly after dark, usually between 8 and 9 o'clock. You slept for 3 to 4 hours. Then you woke up, naturally, somewhere around midnight. You stayed awake for an hour, maybe 2, and then you went back to sleep until dawn. This cycle of first sleep, the watch, and second sleep was simply a fact of life, as unremarkable as eating lunch. Ekirch's genius was in demonstrating just how universal and how casual this pattern was. He didn't find a handful of obscure references. He found over 500, spanning 1,000 years and multiple continents. The key evidence wasn't dramatic proclamations about the nature of sleep. It was the opposite. Writers mentioned first and second sleep the way we might mention breakfast, in passing, without explanation, because no explanation was needed. Homer's Odyssey, composed in the 8th century BC but drawing on an oral tradition far older, uses the Greek phrase protos hupnos, first sleep, as ordinary domestic vocabulary. It appears in the text with zero fanfare, which is exactly what makes it so convincing. Nobody explains it to the reader, because the reader already knows what it means. Though it's worth noting that many modern translations quietly smooth over this phrasing entirely, replacing it with something more familiar to contemporary ears. Chaucer uses first sleep in the Canterbury Tales. A 16th century Brazilian account describes indigenous sleeping patterns in the same segmented structure. Travelers' journals from 19th century Oman record it. Legal depositions from England and France reference what witnesses were doing between their first and second sleeps as routine courtroom detail, the same way a modern witness might say, "I was on my lunch break." Ekirch kept finding it everywhere he looked, in every century, in every genre of document until the early 1800s. And then, over the course of roughly a single generation, the references vanish. We'll get to why they vanish, but first we need to talk about where all of this sleeping was actually happening, because the physical reality of the pre-industrial bed tends to get airbrushed out of these conversations. For most of history, most people slept on straw. Sometimes heather, sometimes rushes, sometimes a sack of wool if you were lucky. You slept in your clothes or in a loose shift, and you slept with other people. Your spouse, your children, your guests, and in some cases, if you were traveling and stopped at an inn, complete strangers. Communal sleeping was the default for the simple reason that private bedrooms did not exist for ordinary people, and heat was expensive. Bodies were insulation. This created problems that required solutions. Elaborate social codes governed who slept where and in what position. You slept on your side, facing away from the person next to you. Certain spots in the bed had hierarchical significance. The etiquette around all of this was detailed and serious, because the alternative was chaos, or worse, scandal. And through all of it, threaded through the straw and the fleas and the strangers, was the reliable architecture of first sleep, the watch, and second sleep. But the night looked very different depending on who you were. If you were a lord or a wealthy merchant, your experience of darkness was another world entirely. You had a private chamber. You had heavy bed curtains that sealed you into a warm, enclosed space. You might have had a night attendant, someone whose literal job was to watch over you as you slept, tend the fire, and be available if you needed anything during the watch. The structure of biphasic sleep appears to have been consistent across classes, but the texture of it varied enormously between a peasant huddled on a straw pallet with 4 other bodies and an aristocrat behind a canopy in a room of their own. So what did people actually do during the watch? The short answer is everything. The long answer is more interesting, because the watch occupied a strange category in pre-industrial life. It was both utterly mundane and quietly sacred, a stretch of time that people filled with chores, intimacy, prayer, and something that looks, from a modern vantage point, remarkably like meditation. The most common activities were practical. You got up, you added wood to the fire, because if you let it die in January, you might not wake up for your second sleep at all. You checked on livestock. You took medicines that your doctor had specifically prescribed for the interval between sleeps. You visited neighbors, which sounds bizarre to modern ears, but makes more sense when you remember that many people lived in close communal arrangements where someone 2 doors down was 20 feet away, not a car ride. Then there was intimacy. Daytime privacy, as we've discussed, essentially did not exist for ordinary people. You were surrounded by family, by coworkers, by the constant social surveillance of village life. The watch was the one reliable window of seclusion that most couples had. It was, by wide consensus, the preferred time for intimacy. And this wasn't just folk tradition. Early modern physicians actively endorsed it. Medical texts from the 16th and 17th centuries specifically recommended the watch as the optimal time for conception, on the theory that the body was rested from its first sleep, but not yet groggy with the second. Doctors offered postural advice, dietary recommendations, the works. Medicalization of the watch is one of the clearest pieces of evidence we have that biphasic sleep was completely normalized across every layer of society, from peasant households all the way up to the professional medical establishment. But the watch had a stranger, harder to categorize dimension as well. People who woke between their two sleeps were not in a state of ordinary alertness. They occupied a liminal, hypnagogic zone, state between sleeping and waking, where the residue of dreams hadn't fully cleared. Modern sleep science has a framework for this. The transition out of slow-wave sleep produces measurable changes in brain chemistry, and the wakefulness that follows carries a distinct cognitive signature, a kind of soft, reflective, inward-facing awareness that is different from how you feel when you wake up in the morning to an alarm. The French word dorveil captures this perfectly. Dormir and veiller, sleep and wake, compressed into a single state. You were both, and neither, and the people living in this rhythm knew it felt different from regular consciousness. This quality made the watch valuable to thinkers. The quiet, the darkness, the residual dream state, all of it made the interval between sleeps fertile ground for reflection and insight. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, this reputation had become so well established that inventors began marketing devices to exploit it. The most charming of these was the Nocturnal Remembrancer, a writing tablet made of parchment with a horizontal guide built into the frame, so that you could jot down whatever thought or revelation had visited you in the dark without needing to light a candle. It was, in essence, a pre-industrial notepad app, designed for a culture that took its midnight epiphany seriously. And then there was prayer. The spiritual dimension of the watch runs deep, and it cuts across the full spectrum of institutional religion to folk magic. The Catholic Church had long structured its monastic hours around nighttime waking. Matins, the night office, pulled monks from their beds in the small hours for communal psalms and readings. But this wasn't just a monastic discipline imposed from above. By the 15th and 16th centuries, prayer manuals designed for lay people were being published with devotional exercises specifically sequenced for the watch. These weren't generic prayer books with a nighttime section tacked on. They were structured around the assumption that their reader would wake between first and second sleep. The prayers were ordered, they were timed, and they treated the waking interval as a spiritual appointment. At the other end of the religious spectrum, the watch was when folk magic happened. The same liminal quality that made the interval attractive to monks and philosophers made it feel to ordinary people like the thinnest point between the visible world and whatever lay beyond it. Protective charms, small rituals, whispered invocations against illness or misfortune. These flourished in the dark space between sleeps, performed away from the scrutiny and social judgment of daylight. The watch was the 1 hour where you were alone with the unseen world, and people behaved accordingly, whether they were clutching a rosary or burying a charm under the threshold. So if biphasic sleep was this deeply woven into human life for over 1,000 years, what killed it? The answer, like most answers about the modern world, comes down to money and light. The first blow was artificial illumination. For all of human history up to the late 18th century, darkness was essentially absolute. A candle or an oil lamp could light a small room, poorly, at meaningful expense. Darkness was a physical fact that shaped the entire structure of daily life. And going to bed shortly after sunset was not a lifestyle choice, it was the only reasonable option. Then gaslighting arrived. Street lamps appeared in London in the 1810s, in Paris shortly after, and within a few decades, the night streets of major European cities were transformed. For the first time, you could walk outside after dark and see where you were going. Coffee houses stayed open later, theaters pushed their curtain times back, social life migrated into the evening hours, and bedtime, which had been anchored to dusk for millennia, started drifting later and later. The incandescent bulb, commercially viable in the 1880s, finished the job. Electric light made it possible to turn any room into daytime at the flick of a switch, and the psychological effect was enormous. The night, which had been a sovereign territory with its own rhythms and customs and spiritual weather, became simply an extension of the day, a space to be filled with more activity, more productivity, more waking. But the light alone didn't kill the two-sleep pattern. Light pushed bedtime later, but in theory, people could have adjusted by sleeping later in the morning. What made that impossible was the second blow, the factory bell. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how people worked, it changed how people experienced time itself. In an agrarian society, your day was organized by the sun. You worked when it was light, you stopped when it got dark. The hours in between were flexible, shaped by weather and season. A farmer in December kept a very different schedule from a farmer in June, and nobody expected otherwise. The factory couldn't tolerate that kind of flexibility. Factories ran on synchronized labor. Every worker needed to be at their station at the same hour, every day, regardless of the season, regardless of the sunrise. The clock replaced the sun as the organizing principle of human life, but it was a fundamentally asymmetric relationship. The agrarian sun was a mutual agreement between human biology and nature. The industrial clock was a one-way demand. It brought with it a new, non-negotiable directive: be awake, alert, and productive at a fixed time every morning or else. This is what compressed sleep into a single block. When your bedtime creeps to 10 or 11 because gas lamps have rewritten the social calendar, and your wake-up time is locked at 5 or 6 because the factory whistle doesn't care about what the sun is doing, the math simply doesn't leave room for a 2-hour watch in the middle of the night. 8 hours was all you had, and you needed every minute of it unconscious. Sleep became a utility, something to be optimized for maximum efficiency like coal or labor. And remarkably quickly, people forgot that it had ever been any other way. Ekirch traced the disappearance in the language itself. References to first sleep and second sleep declined sharply through the 19th century and are effectively gone by the early 20th. Within 100 years of widespread artificial lighting, a sleep pattern that had been universal for at least a millennium had been so thoroughly erased that when Ekirch published his findings in 2001, they were received as a revelation. The history of sleep had fallen into its own kind of amnesia. Everything we've discussed so far is history. Compelling history, but history nonetheless. And history can tell you what people did, but it can't tell you whether they did it because their biology demanded it or because their circumstances shaped it. The question that hangs over all of Ekirch's research is a simple one. Is biphasic sleep actually in our wiring, or was it just a behavioral adaptation to a world without light bulbs? In the early 1990s, a sleep researcher at the National Institute of Mental Health named Thomas Wehr designed an experiment to find out. The setup was elegant. Wehr took 15 healthy male volunteers and removed the modern world from their nights. No electric light, no screens, obviously, because this was the early 90s, but also no lamps, no candles, nothing. For 1 month, each subject was placed in complete darkness for 14 hours a night, roughly from 6 in the evening to 8 in the morning. mimicking the long winter nights that our pre-industrial ancestors would have experienced at northern latitudes. For the first week or so, the subjects simply slept a lot. They were, like most modern people, carrying a substantial sleep debt, and their bodies used the early phase of the experiment to pay it off. But once that debt was cleared, something remarkable happened. Their sleep reorganized itself. By the 4th week, every subject had settled into a stable, consistent pattern. They fell asleep for about 4 hours, woke up for 1 to 2 hours, then fell asleep again for another 4 hours. 2 sleeps, separated by a quiet interval of wakefulness. The pattern appeared spontaneously, without any instruction or suggestion. Nobody told them about Roger Ekirch or the 1st and 2nd sleep. Their bodies simply did it on their own. Case closed. Biphasic sleep is the human factory setting, and we've been doing it wrong since Edison? It turns out the picture is more complicated than that. In 2015, a team led by Jerome Siegel at UCLA published a study of 3 contemporary hunter-gatherer societies living without electricity or artificial light: the Hadza in Tanzania, the San in Namibia and Botswana, and the Tsimane in Bolivia. These groups are as close as we can get to observing human sleep cycle outside the pressures of industrial civilization, and what Siegel's team found was surprising. The Hadza, the San, and the Tsimane all slept on average in one largely consolidated block. Biphasic sleep was not the dominant pattern. They went to sleep a few hours after sunset, slept 6 to 7 hours, and woke up. This seems to contradict Wehr entirely, until you notice the variable that connects these two findings: darkness. All 3 of Siegel's groups live near the equator, where nights are roughly 11 to 12 hours year-round. There is no dramatic seasonal swing. Wehr's subjects, on the other hand, were exposed to 14 hours of darkness, the equivalent of a deep northern winter. And that, it appears, is the key. Human sleep has a flexibility built into it, a capacity to restructure itself based on the length of the night. Short, equatorial nights produce consolidated sleep. Long winter nights produce segmented sleep. The biology doesn't mandate one pattern or the other. It offers a range, and the environment selects from that range. This means that biphasic sleep isn't a universal human default. It is something more interesting, a seasonal adaptation, a biological capacity that was activated for much of the year across most of the inhabited world outside the tropics. Every European, Middle Eastern, and East Asian civilization that left written records did so at latitudes where winter nights stretched to 14 hours or more. For these cultures, segmented sleep wasn't a choice or a habit. It was what human biology does when darkness lasts that long. The light bulb didn't correct a flaw, it simply made the trigger disappear. So here you are at 3 a.m. staring at your ceiling. Your bedroom is climate controlled, your mattress is engineered, your sheets are clean and free of anything that might bite you in the night. You are, by every material measure, sleeping in conditions that a medieval king would have found miraculous. And yet your body has done something that your medieval king's body also did. It has woken you up in the middle of the night, right on schedule, for an appointment that no longer exists on your calendar. The cruel irony of the 3 a.m. wake up is that the waking itself is not the problem. The problem is what happens next. In the world of first and second sleep, you would have surfaced into the soft, hypnagogic quiet of Dorvale, added a log to the fire, maybe said a prayer or murmur to your spouse in the dark, and drifted back down within an hour or 2. There was no clock to check, no meeting in 6 hours to worry about, no concept of lost sleep to generate anxiety, because sleep was not yet something that you could lose. It was a rhythm, not a resource. We don't have that luxury today. We have alarm clocks and shift schedules and the relentless arithmetic of If I fall asleep right now, I can still get 5 hours. The moment you start calculating, you've already lost. Cortisol spikes, heart rate rises, and the wakefulness that might have been peaceful, even generative, curdles into anxiety. The fear of not sleeping is, for most people, substantially worse than the waking itself. We have managed to turn a natural phase of human rest into a source of genuine suffering, and we've done it with nothing more than a clock and a commute. But before we romanticize the old world too aggressively, we should be honest about what we've gained. The historian's temptation is always to frame the past as a lost paradise, and the biphasic sleep story lends itself beautifully to that framing. Sacred midnight hours, dreamlike liminal states, whispered prayers in the dark. It sounds gorgeous, but the people living inside that rhythm were also sleeping in their clothes on insect-ridden straw, inches from strangers, in houses they couldn't lock, in a darkness so complete that stepping outside to relieve yourself was a genuine physical hazard. The night was sacred partly because it was terrifying. By almost any metric you care to name, the 21st century is the golden age of sleep comfort. We have solved problems that haunted every generation before us. Temperature regulation, pest control, physical safety, personal space, pain management. The consolidated 8-hour block may be a historical novelty, but so is sleeping without being bitten, and most of us would choose the latter. The point of all this is not to tell you to throw out your mattress and start sleeping on straw in 2 shifts. The point is much simpler and much more immediately useful. The next time you wake up at 3 a.m., you have a choice. You can reach for your phone, check the time, and begin the familiar spiral of arithmetic and dread. Or you can lie there in the dark and know that your body is doing something very old, something that your ancestors did every single night for centuries, something that had a name and a purpose and a place in the architecture of human life long before anyone decided it was a disease. You are not malfunctioning. What you're doing was normal for thousands of years. And if you can hold that thought, if you can let the watch be the watch, even for a few minutes, there is a decent chance you'll fall back asleep before you know it. Not because you've cured anything, but because you've stopped fighting the one thing that was never a fight in the first place. Thank you so much for watching. This was Folks of Yore. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button, subscribing, hitting the notification bell, and leave a comment about your thoughts. See you next time.